Hello, Chipmunk and Chipette fans. My name is Grandy Tamias, the speculative evolved species of upright walking chipmunk, and welcome back to another Alvin and the Chipmunks anniversary retrospective. This time I'll be covering the third installment of the live-action film series, Alvin and the Chipmunks Chipwrecked, released in 2011 by 20th Century Fox at a time before they were bought out by Disney. I do have a few things to say about these films as a whole, so if you'd rather skip to the retrospective portion, I'll leave a time code in the description or on screen. Now, on this channel, I've had a habit of praising these films one video, and then in the next saying things about them that tend to upset those of you who grew up on them. This video will be more on the praising side, trust me, but I say this because I was already working on another script for an elaboration about the possibility of these films being rebooted and when it might happen, and realized that this cycle was happening. And then the news that the franchise is being sold made that script outdated. As I said last year, I do like these movies a lot more than the critics do, and not solely just for dumb fun, as I'll get into with this film later. However, I am still reserved about my liking of this film series since I recognize some of its flaws now and because I now prefer the source material. And that latter part is my biggest problem with the fanbase of these films. I don't necessarily have a problem with fans saying that they like the movies more, only that many of them completely disregard the source material like it doesn't exist or doesn't matter in the grand scheme of these movies' greatness. Like, most Star Wars fans love Empire Strikes Back over the 1977 film, I refuse to call it New Hope, but even it can't exist in a vacuum. Regardless if it's a reboot to something that came before or a sequel to it, the original still provides context for the existence of the new thing, and Chipwrecked is no exception. And I'm not talking about the 2007 film leading up to Chipwrecked, since these movies don't really care about connecting with each other's plots. There's a specific episode called Island Fever of the 1980s cartoon that follows a similar premise to this movie. The chipmunks are on a cruise ship, fall overboard, and wash up on an island. So you wouldn't have this movie if it weren't for that. And it just goes to show that you should always respect the source material, because it might end up inspiring something you enjoy. Maybe it'll inspire you to check it out, and maybe you'll like it too. Anyway, right off the bat, I'm not going to go scene by scene like in some of my other retrospectives, because with this film, I have a lot to say about my experiences with it, and talking about every single moment would drag this video on, and I don't want a repeat of my half-hour road trip retrospective. Speaking of which, in my road trip review, I mentioned how I was going back and forth about whether this film or Chipwrecked was my favorite live-action chipmunk film, and I decided it's Chipwrecked. I just love the action, drama, and adventure of this film. Road Trip certainly had a strong family theme, but some of the humor was dry, and the villain Suggs was a bit too over the top. In Chipwrecked, most of the humor works for me, especially once they got to the island, and while Ian is back, more on him later, he's less of an antagonist in this film in order to make room for the natural dangers of the island and Zoe, which was a fresh change. I saw this movie twice in the theater, the first time being Saturday on opening weekend, and I even have a picture of me and my brother next to some of the statues in the lobby. Wow. You can't see my face, but I am just astonished that that used to be me at age 12. Speaking of 12, that's currently the percentage that this film has on Rotten Tomatoes, which is the lowest of any theatrical Alvin and the Chipmunks film. Even without my nostalgia goggles, I can think of much worse films that have much higher Rotten Tomatoes scores than that. In fact, this is the film that made me realize that Rotten Tomatoes is meaningless. That said, there are still some problems that I will agree with. I did say that the humor was a lot better. In fact, there's less toilet humor in this film, but some of the pop culture references and real-world references came off as a little strange. At one point, Alvin says, "You can follow me on Critter," which, in addition to making us all realize how old Twitter is, doesn't really make sense because, in the very next film, Dave mentions that Twitter exists in this universe. They already mentioned in the first film and showed in the squeakquel that YouTube exists, as well as the mention of Instagram and Road Trip, so there's no need to hide that social media is the same to them as in the real world. But that's just a teensy little nitpick. What's worse is that Alvin references that Honey Badger video, which I looked up after seeing this film, and I was shocked by how profane it is. Like, I certainly couldn't have been the only one curious about that after watching this movie, and I'm sure many parents got upset that their kids looked for it too. Besides, it wasn't even a honey badger, it was a meerkat. Alvin should know since he and his brothers were watching Meerkat Manor in the previous movie. Ian Hawke, as I mentioned, is less prevalent in this film, which in part leads up to his change of heart at the end. Conveniently, he just so happens to be on the ship and is mainly there to slow Dave down. A lot of the scenes between him and Dave on the island just felt like filler in between everything that the Chipmunks were doing, and his change at the end wasn't really all that surprising, and doesn't really feel as impactful as it was trying to be in the context of this film. Keywords being in this film. I appreciate that Ian's rivalry with the Chipmunks, Chipettes, and Dave is one of the few things that these films bothered to keep continuity with, but he doesn't do anything bad enough in Chipwrecked to warrant that change. I get it, this is for what happened in the previous two films, but Chipwrecked isn't either of those two films. For Ian's change to feel more impactful, he should have done something just as bad as what he did in the Squeakquel or 2007 film. And this is what I mentioned in a previous video when I said that Ian's arc was disjointed. The worst thing Ian does to Dave and the Chipmunks in this film is report them to the captain, but even then, Alvin and Simon were already at fault, independent of Ian being on the boat. Now let's move on to the good. As I've said in previous videos, I would love to see an entire movie or episode just dedicated to showing how chipmunks in this universe live in the wild, and this movie is one of the few things in this franchise that comes close, along with the very beginning of the 2007 film. Personally, I'd rather see this done in a prehistoric setting with chipmunks who aren't the main six, but I'm getting off track again. As Brittany says, they used to be used to living in the wild, which just goes to show how accustomed they got to humans and their society, and that they've lost their natural instincts. Because of that, there was also a greater sense of danger as they had to fight for survival. The Chipmunks and Chipettes in this film are portrayed with a lot of energy and playful spirit, but also have a sense of maturity. In fact, I'd say a large portion of characters develop in some way by the end of this movie. As I already mentioned, Ian turns good, as well as Zoe. Dave learns to show that he can trust his kids to be more responsible. Simon is able to loosen up and do daring things like admit how he feels towards Jeanette. Theodore slowly gets over his fear of jungle monsters, which to be fair doesn't seem all that hard when they look like this and that this universe is Hollywood made four of them. Brittany becomes more resourceful in the wild after previously admitting that she wasn't used to it, and even shows her knowledge of volcanology near the end. And Alvin, I'd say, gets the most development. He comes into his own with responsibility to the point of taking after Dave, as Brittany points out, plus he also shows some leadership near the end when he directs the others to build an escape raft. Although I will say that Alvin's maturity to leadership is something that could still be developed in regards to the wider franchise. Like, no one around him seems to doubt him, nor does he lack confidence in his abilities. I don't know, I just like the idea of Alvin always wanting to be a leader because he likes the feeling of being on top, but when he's actually called to it, he learns that leadership is not all that it's cracked up to be and has to cope with that. So overall, in regards to the characters and their development, while not perfect, I definitely think it's a good job and something that this film doesn't get nearly enough credit for. Next thing I want to talk about is Simone, the sort of breakout character of this film who we never saw again. He's pretty much this film's version of the Buzz Lightyear Spanish mode from Toy Story 3. The spider that caused his transformation is something that I plan to elaborate on in a future video, but for now I want to talk about Simon from a psychological perspective. Obviously, this personality had to come from somewhere. We know from the next film that Simon can speak Spanish, meaning that he can speak multiple languages, so it's possible that he may know French as well, which would therefore explain how Simone speaks it. As for his personality, the spider venom was said to cause loss of inhibition, explaining how Simon would begin to act more on impulse, like Alvin, without the feelings of insecurity that normally hold Simon back. Allowing him to take physical risks, like death-defying stunts, as well as emotional risks, like admitting his feelings to Jeanette. So Simone is in essence an extension of Simon, derived from his inner desire to loosen up and personally enjoy life in a way that his own loyalties to Dave and following rules never would have let him. Discounting Simone, the only other major new character in this film with relevance to the plot is Zoe. She starts out as a companion to the Chipmunks and Chipettes, saying that she was also stranded, but is later revealed to have purposefully gone to the island to search for treasure. The film's novelization and a deleted scene go into more detail behind her motivation, explaining that she used to be a waitress at a seafood restaurant, who is told about the treasure by a customer who didn't have enough money to pay for his meal, and drew a map to the treasure on the back of a kid's menu. Though one plot hole I thought of while writing this video, if Zoe went to the island on purpose, how did she get there and how did she expect to get off the island? If she was dropped off by someone, she'd need a way to communicate back with them once she was ready to leave, meaning that she'd probably need a long-range radio. Or maybe she had her own boat and docked it somewhere secluded. Either of those would have made the Chipmunks getting off the island much easier, but then again, Zoe was evil, so she wouldn't have told them. And either of those methods could have been destroyed when the volcano erupted, so I guess it doesn't matter. Speaking of the eruption, ending the film with a volcano destroying the island was pretty dramatic for a franchise like this, if a little cliché and contrived at the same time. Like, it's a pretty big coincidence that the island was set to explode within mere days of the Chipmunks, Chipettes, Dave, and Ian arriving. In real life, volcanoes can sometimes go tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years between eruptions. But I guess if they hadn't arrived, Zoe would have been burned and buried alive under a pyroclastic flow. But of course, this is a kids' movie, so I'm not going to complain about how they realistically would have died or how scientifically inaccurate the volcano eruption is, though if being launched halfway across the jungle didn't kill that honey badger earlier, the volcano most certainly did. Yeah, bet you didn't think of that dark implication until now, didn't you? I will say that it was sad to see Chipwrecked Island go. It was such an exotic location full of adventure and mystery. It seemed like a perfect natural playground for the chipmunks. Now it's just a barren wasteland of flattened trees and layers of ash. Heck, it would still be in the process of recovering by now. But that chipmunk-sized natural hot tub that Brittany used was pretty cool. If Present Me had written this movie, I wouldn't have changed much besides making the volcano less of an imminent threat, except maybe ditch the whole treasure aspect and replace Zoe with a new chipmunk character instead. Maybe this new chipmunk was also stranded on the island, and their time there made them experienced and helped the chipmunks and chipettes survive as well. Come to think of it, a new chipmunk also could have replaced Simone at the same time, and maybe forms a bond with Simon that convinces him to be less uptight. Plus, it would also solve that problem that you all know I have by now: more chipmunks to universe build the franchise with. That's 3 birds with 1 stone. In all seriousness, though, as it is, Chipwrecked is still a great movie in my opinion, even 10 years later. It's the most fun this version of the characters have ever been, and it took a big risk that paid off by moving the characters outside of civilization to focus on an unknown land of new opportunities for adventure and character growth. Oh, and I guess I'll briefly mention the music. I felt like it was a little lacking this time around in terms of quantity, plus some of them don't really stand out as well as other Movieverse Chipmunk covers like You Spin Me Right Around from the previous movie, and the soundtrack makes me realize how old Party Rock Anthem is. Wow, 2011 was a crazy time in our culture. Anyway, I hope you all have a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. Feel free to let me know in the comments your thoughts on Alvin and the Chipmunks Chipwrecked and how it has impacted you after all these years. If you want to suggest a topic for my elaboration series, leave it in the comments or message me on Twitter or Discord, which are linked in the description. I would also appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe if you haven't, as that will go a long way in helping me bring you even more content that you'll love. With all that said, I hope you enjoyed, have a nice day, and thank you for your time.